Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to ask a question or answer a question, I keep doing that, from Jeremy Mason 9802. Asks, do you think game development is harder or worse nowadays compared to, say, the 90s? Or is it better? Or the same? Here's how I'm going to answer that, because I think that is a very nuanced question that needs a nuanced answer. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you some things that I think are better. I'm going to tell you some things that I think are worse. And I'm going to tell you some things that go either way, mainly because depending on you, you may think it's a better thing, you may think it's a worse thing, or you may not even care about that thing. So let me start with what I think is better. And also, I think it's funny that you said the 90s, since I started in 1981. There's a whole decade there, the 80s, where it was crazy, and factors into the first thing I'm going to say. So here are the ways I think the game industry is now better. It is now much, much, much easier to learn how to make games. There are YouTube tutorials explaining how to do it. There are multiple game engines available for free. There are classes online. There are classes at universities. There are classes in high schools. Actually, there's a class in a junior high school that I know about. So much easier. So much easier to learn how to do game development. It's not even funny. So those of you who try to use that as an excuse, oh, it's so hard to do game development, you have no idea how hard it was. On the Atari 800, which is what I first learned on, there was almost nothing available. I had to learn BASIC from other books and then figure out what was different about Atari BASIC. I had to go through memory maps and technical schematics to figure out where interrupts were mapped to memory locations so I could poke them. Sometimes I didn't know what values to use, so I would just poke them with different values and saw what happened. That's how you did things in the 80s. Now it's not only easier to learn how to do it, it's a little easier, I think, to get started doing it. I'm not getting a job, I'll talk about that later, but just to get started, you can download a game engine, you can download free assets for it, and not just art assets. You can get scripts and code and, sounds. You could have a game up and running in minutes or hours, where in the 80s, you would have to spend months before you'd even begin to see the tiniest of game show up on your machine. So that's the first way I think things have gotten better. Second way I think things have gotten better is pay is better. I know a lot of people going, no, it's not, it still pays badly. It pays better than it did in the 80s and the 90s. Way better. I've already told the story, so I'm not going to repeat it, where when I tried to apply for a mortgage in 95, the mortgage dealer literally was in shock at how little I was being paid. Next, he said, compared to people who have master's degrees in computer science and are doing programming at companies within 2 blocks of where you work, you are dramatically underpaid and you qualify for no loan through any lender I represent. And I was like, so the pay's better now. Housing is worse, but base pay, even adjusted for inflation, is way better now. Related to that, hours are better. Many people worked many hours more than 8 in the 80s and 90s, and even into the early 2000s. Part of it was passion, part of it was necessity. There was just no way to get games finished without crunch. Management was... games were in their early form. People didn't understand the phases you needed to do. They didn't understand games as art. They didn't understand what things could be managed and what things needed to be just time boxed, and say, let's see how much we can get done in this amount of time. Things could get really bad. Things weren't identified as being critical path or needing fallbacks in case their design or implementation failed. We've gotten better at that, and because of that, hours have gotten better. It also has helped that years ago, things like EA Spouse blogged about how bad crunch was at Electronic Arts and helped get the ball rolling on getting things better. So ours are better. Could they be better still? Yes, but they're way better than they were. And then finally, the fact that there are specialists now in the game industry helps so much. Back in the 80s and 90s, you had to be a jack of all trades. I had to know how to do graphics. Yes, a colorblind programmer had to learn how to do graphics. I had to know how to do sound. I had to know how to do... I had to write my own installers for the games because there was no generalized installer, so we had to write an installer for each game we wrote. You had to know how lots of different hardware, not just video hardware, CD-ROMs all worked differently. You had to learn how to do error handling, all of this, networking. Now there are specialists. There are people like, all I do is graphics. All I do is networking. It is so much better having people who know and study those things. So that's the 4 ways I think things have gotten better. So now let me tell you about a few ways I think things have gotten worse. This is all my opinion, but you asked. There are less original ideas floating around now. Now, let me put that in a bunch of conditionals. When we started in the 80s and 90s, well, especially in the 80s, there were very few video games, almost no PC games. So almost anything you did was original. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, it was original. By the time you get into the 90s, and certainly starting in the 2000s, people would have ideas, and these had been done before. Often they didn't know. People didn't bother to play older games, so they had no idea they were reinventing a wheel. And sometimes that meant they went into the exact same pitfalls the game that had that idea had. Sometimes they knew about it, and they said, well, I have a new idea with a twist. So sometimes you saw an original idea, but it was an old idea with a little twist to it. Original ideas still occurred, but I remember even in the late 90s telling people I worked with in the video game business that I was seeing more original ideas in tabletop. I mean, that's where I got the ideas for Fate Points and Arcanum, Flaws in Outer Worlds. There were just a lot of really cool ideas going on in tabletop. Related to this is discovery. It is much, much, much harder now having your game be discovered by players. There are so many games coming out. Steam is overloaded. The App Store on iPhones is overloaded. Epic has a lot of games in it. If you still get ads online, I mean, I put up as many blockers as I can and pay for streaming services. I can't remember the last time I saw an ad. But getting people to even know your game's out is hard. It's why YouTube influencers and Twitch players and Let's Play and having streamers play your game is now a way to get people to know your game is even coming out. Even conventions are starting to die off. I mean, E3, it's hard to be discovered. And indies, I think, feel that pain harder than anyone because you may make a really good game. And by the way, they got a lot of original ideas going on there, but getting people to learn that your game is out and has this cool idea is really hard. Which gets me into marketing. I've said, and this is a thread and sub-thread on previous videos, some of the issues I've had with marketing in the past. Like demanding demos, demanding features. Well, marketing design really got in bed together in the last 10 or 15 years. I remember going to meetings and hearing terms. Now, I know I use a lot of terms, like I throw out RPG and MMO and all this, to the point where when I was dating an architect, he's like, I can't understand half of what you say about games. But I would go to game development meetings, and I'd hear people saying ARPPU, and COGs, and DAUs, and MAUs, and IPs, and I'm like, I knew what some of them were, but they were actually throwing these out as if they were relevant to game design. They are related to game design, but these are people who wanted me to change my game design to support ARPPU, average revenue per paying user. COG, cost of goods. Do you really need that manual? DAU versus MAU, daily average user, monthly average user. IAPs, in-app purchases, which you all know as microtransactions. What started back with that horse armor has grown into an entire industry financial support pillar. So I don't think this is a good thing. It is not supporting design for good design, it's supporting design to make money. So for the same reason I think player agency is good but player addiction is not, this intrusion of marketing into game design is not a good thing. Will it make money? Yes, because many of you will spend money on things like this. I wish, and I've said this in many of my videos, I wish people would vote more with their wallet. If a game comes out that you don't like, and you can, if there's not a demo, watch one of the streamers play it. If you don't think you like it, don't play it. Don't buy it. Certainly, I never advocate doing early purchase because just wait for it to come out. It'll cost the same. So let me talk about some other things though that aren't better or worse. I could go either way on this. Getting a job. I've seen people argue that it was harder back then. I've seen people argue that it's harder now. Let me tell you my impression of what's going on. Back then, there were way fewer game jobs to be had. But there were also way fewer people going for them. So anything that made you stand out. Oh, you have a degree in programming? Oh, you've already made a game? Oh, you have written some software that's really appropriate to what the game we're making? Come on in. Now, you can learn game development much easier. That was one of my first points. However, you compete against a lot more people. So often when people tell me how to get a job, that's when I say, you should have a demo. Because other people will, and that will make them go to the top of the heap. Won't necessarily get them hired, but it will certainly get them considered before you if you don't have a demo. So basically back then there were fewer jobs to be had, and that's why it was hard to get a job. Now there are a lot more jobs, but there's a lot more people looking for it. I did an entire video on team size getting bigger. So I'm not going to repeat all of those, but let me just say that bigger teams, there are a lot of great things you get from bigger teams, and there's a lot of bad things you get from bigger teams. So this is going to be a taste choice for you. Do you care about how big teams have gotten? If you do, you may want to look for companies that may either make smaller scoped games or go indie. And then finally, the third thing that's kind of related to that is much longer development time. I've made a game, my shortest game was Bard's Tale, which only took a few months. Temple only took 18, 20 months. But then I worked on WildStar, the MMO, for 6 years, and it didn't ship for another 3 years after I left. So there are some games that just take really long development. This can be a great thing. You can make bigger games with more features. It can be a bad thing too. You might burn out. There's more turnover. So you'll be working with different people, and maybe you'll like them and maybe you won't. But also, it puts a big gap in your resume. I went from not having a game since 2004 with Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines until 2014 with South Park The Stick of Truth. That's a 10-year gap in a 42-year development career. That 10-year gap is big, and I have to explain it as I lost 6 years at Carbine and then went to a new studio where a game was supposed to come out in 6 months and it took another 3 years. So longer development, pro or con, depending on how you look at it. So what would I say overall? Wow, I'm going on a long time. What would I say overall? Overall, I think things are better now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. But from what I've said, I think it's going to depend on you, what role you want in game development, and what you want to get out of it. You can certainly find a satisfying job at a big company. You will almost certainly be one of many, many, many people working. I've heard people say, well, I feel like a cog in a machine here. Okay, go indie. Oh, but then you might lose insurance or guaranteed employment, or it might be contractual. So it's the pro and con thing. It depends on what you're looking for. But let me tell you now, these days you have options. In the 80s, there were no options. You took what the industry offered or you went and did something else. And a lot of people I know went and did something else. I have a whole video too on why I was stubborn and didn't go do anything else. So anyway, I hope Jeremy Mason, that answers your question on do I think game dev is better now or back then.